Most employees believe a raise is something you ask for. They rehearse the conversation, they gather their courage, they sit across from a manager and explain why they deserve more money. They talk about their hard work, their dedication, their loyalty. And in that moment, without realizing it, they commit the first strategic mistake. They beg. Not with their words, perhaps, but with their position. Because the moment you ask for value, you place the power in someone else's hands. And power, once surrendered, is rarely returned. This is the quiet illusion that governs most workplaces, an illusion repeated so often that people mistake it for reality. Work hard, be patient, be loyal. Then one day, when the time feels right, politely request what you deserve. But Machiavelli understood something about human systems that most people spend their entire lives refusing to see. Power does not reward obedience. Power rewards leverage. The workplace is not a classroom where effort is graded fairly. It is closer to a silent battlefield of hierarchy, perception, and quiet dominance tests. Some employees operate like prey animals, predictable, eager to please, hoping recognition will eventually arrive. Others move like predators, calm, observant, strategic. They rarely ask. Instead, they create situations where the organization begins to fear losing them. This difference changes everything, because the psychology of a raise is not about effort. It is about perceived loss. Human beings are biologically wired to protect what they believe they might lose. Behavioral economists call it loss aversion, but long before modern psychology gave it a name, power strategists understood the principle instinctively. People fight harder to avoid losing something than to gain something new. If your boss believes you are replaceable, your request for a raise triggers calculation. They compare your cost against alternatives. They measure your performance against the market. They analyze numbers. But if your boss believes losing you would create instability, inconvenience, disruption, the calculation changes. Now the conversation is no longer about your value. It is about their risk. And risk terrifies institutions. This is why the Machiavellian approach never begins with a request. It begins with a transformation of perception. Most employees are trained from the beginning to behave in ways that make them easy to control. They respond quickly, they follow instructions, they avoid confrontation, they try to appear agreeable. They believe this makes them valuable. In reality, it makes them safe to ignore. Predictability lowers perceived threat, and low threat means low urgency. Think about the individuals inside your workplace who seem to command attention without asking for it. The ones whose absence would immediately create chaos. The ones whose opinions are consulted before decisions are made. Notice something subtle. They rarely explain their worth. It is assumed, because value that must be explained is rarely believed. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. Right now, in your workplace, which category do you belong to? Are you the one quietly waiting for recognition, or the one whose absence would create consequences? Be honest, because most people discover when they examine their position with brutal honesty that they have spent years building the wrong type of reputation: reliable, cooperative, replaceable. This realization unsettles people, and it should, because once you see the game clearly, you cannot pretend it operates on fairness anymore. The office is not governed by merit alone. It is governed by perception of power, and perception can be engineered. But doing so requires abandoning the psychological posture most employees cling to, the posture of the obedient worker hoping to be rewarded. Machiavellian strategy begins somewhere far more dangerous, with control over how others calculate your importance. And that calculation rarely happens through words. It happens through patterns. Patterns of behavior, patterns of presence, patterns of silence. When these patterns shift in the right way, something interesting begins to happen inside the minds of those above you. Uncertainty appears, and uncertainty in hierarchical environments spreads faster than confidence. The moment uncertainty enters the equation, the balance of power quietly begins to move. But to understand how that shift is created, you first have to confront one of the most uncomfortable truths about modern workplaces. A truth that most employees sense but refuse to articulate. Because once you understand it, you can never return to playing the game the same way again. Most employees are trained to believe their value comes from effort. Work harder, stay later, volunteer for more tasks, prove your commitment through visible exhaustion. This is the silent ritual of the obedient worker, the ritual of proving worth through sacrifice. And on the surface, it appears logical. After all, organizations claim to reward dedication. But observe carefully. The individuals who rise fastest are rarely the ones working themselves into quiet burnout. The ones who command the highest salaries are not always the ones sweating the hardest at their desks. Something else is happening beneath the surface, something far more psychological. Effort is visible, but power is inferred. And human beings do not assign value purely on labor. They assign value based on perceived scarcity. This principle exists everywhere in nature. A rare resource becomes valuable not because it tries harder, but because it is difficult to replace. Predators in the wild do not chase every animal equally. They calculate. They select targets that appear vulnerable, isolated, expendable. Prey that moves predictably becomes the easiest target. Prey that appears difficult to capture often escapes the hunt entirely. The workplace operates on a surprisingly similar instinct. Managers rarely say this openly, but their decisions are constantly shaped by one silent question. How easily could I replace this person? That question governs promotions, it governs raises, it governs who becomes invisible and who becomes indispensable. And here is where most employees unknowingly sabotage themselves. They try to prove loyalty through over-availability. They respond instantly to every message, accept every request, solve every problem placed in front of them. They believe this behavior signals importance, but psychologically it signals something very different: abundance. And abundance lowers perceived value. Think about the subtle message your behavior sends. When someone knows you will always say yes, always solve the problem, always be available, your presence becomes predictable, expected, taken for granted. Not rare, not strategic, just useful. Useful people are appreciated, but appreciated people are rarely feared to lose. And remember what drives raises in real power structures: not appreciation, fear of disruption. The Machiavellian employee understands this dynamic with cold clarity. They do not rush to prove how hard they work. They construct an environment where their contribution becomes structurally significant. This difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Instead of completing tasks faster, they position themselves closer to decision points. Instead of simply executing instructions, they quietly gather knowledge others depend on. Instead of trying to look busy, they become the silent bridge between critical pieces of information. When this happens, something fascinating occurs inside the organization's subconscious. Dependence begins to form. At first, it is small. A manager starts asking for your input before making certain decisions. A team hesitates when you're absent. Projects move slightly slower without your presence. These signals are easy to miss if you're not paying attention, but they represent the early stages of leverage. Leverage is the true currency of raises, not effort, not loyalty, leverage. Because leverage transforms the psychological frame of the conversation. When an ordinary employee asks for a raise, the manager evaluates whether the employee deserves it. When a strategically positioned employee discusses compensation, the manager evaluates whether losing them would be a mistake. Do you see the difference? One conversation asks for approval, the other triggers risk assessment, and human beings respond very differently when risk enters the equation. But leverage alone is not enough, because the second mistake employees make is revealing their intentions too early. The moment you begin hinting that you want more money, you shift attention onto yourself. Managers become alert, defensive calculations begin. This is why Machiavellian strategy favors something far more powerful than open negotiation: controlled ambiguity. You allow others to notice your increasing importance without announcing your expectations. You let patterns change quietly. Your availability becomes slightly more selective. Your time appears more structured. Your involvement becomes concentrated around moments of importance. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational, just enough change to disrupt assumptions. This subtle shift creates a psychological effect that few employees ever exploit: curiosity. When people cannot easily predict your behavior, they begin paying closer attention, and attention is the first step toward influence. Let me ask you something. Inside your workplace right now, are you predictable? Do people know exactly how you'll respond, how quickly you'll help, how reliably you'll solve problems? Or have you created an atmosphere where your participation carries weight because it is not automatically guaranteed? Answer honestly, because this single distinction separates the employees who remain trapped in quiet dependence from those who begin bending the structure around them. And once that bending begins, the entire game changes. But the next step is where most people lose their nerve, because creating leverage requires something obedient workers fear more than failure: silence. Strategic silence. The kind that forces others to reconsider your position. The kind that makes people wonder what you might do next. And when used correctly, that silence becomes far more powerful than any request you could ever make. Silence unsettles people. Not ordinary silence, not the quiet of someone who has nothing to say. That kind of silence is ignored. Strategic silence is different. Strategic silence appears when people expect your response and it doesn't arrive. It appears when your involvement has been normal for so long that your absence creates a small disturbance in the system. And disturbances force people to think. Most employees spend their careers trying to eliminate disturbances. They smooth every problem, respond instantly, and rush to prove reliability. They believe stability earns trust, but stability also makes you invisible. If a machine always functions perfectly, no one studies it closely. It becomes part of the background. The Machiavellian mind understands this instinctively. Visibility in power structures is rarely created by constant presence. It is created by selective absence. Think about the individuals inside any organization who truly influence outcomes. They are not available every second. They are not constantly explaining themselves. Their time appears guarded. And that guarded presence signals something to the human brain: importance. Scarcity creates gravity. People begin adjusting their behavior around you. Now understand something critical. This is not about becoming lazy. It is not about refusing responsibility. That would make you weak, not powerful. Strategic absence works only when your competence is already known. First, you prove capability. Then you restrict access. When these two forces combine, your presence becomes valuable. Without the first, you are ignored. Without the second, you are exploited. Most employees master the first and completely ignore the second.
They prove competence endlessly while leaving their time completely open, which means their value is constantly consumed. This is the silent trap of the reliable worker. They become the person everyone depends on, but never the person the organization fears losing. Why? Because they have trained everyone to assume they will always be there. Predators in nature study patterns before attacking. They wait until prey reveals predictable behavior. Human power dynamics follow the same principle. Predictability invites control. Scarcity invites respect. Once you begin introducing controlled scarcity into your professional behavior, something interesting begins happening in the minds around you. Managers start noticing subtle friction when you are not present. Conversations slow down, decisions take longer, information flows less smoothly, and suddenly your role begins to feel larger than your job description. This is the beginning of perceived indispensability. But here is where psychological strategy becomes even more powerful, because the Machiavellian employee does not rush to exploit this shift. They allow it to grow. They watch carefully. They observe who becomes uneasy when they are absent, who asks where they are, who hesitates to proceed without their input. These reactions reveal something extremely valuable, the true pressure points of the organization. Not the official hierarchy, the real one. Every workplace has two hierarchies: the visible structure, titles, departments, management charts, and the invisible structure, influence, knowledge control, and dependency. Raises rarely come from the visible hierarchy alone. They come from pressure inside the invisible one. When enough subtle dependency forms around your role, removing you becomes uncomfortable. Uncomfortable decisions trigger protective behavior, and protective behavior is where leverage becomes real. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable again. Inside your workplace, what happens when you disappear for 2 days? Do systems continue smoothly without noticing? Or do small disruptions begin appearing? Do people start asking questions? Do decisions stall? This question reveals more about your true power than any performance review ever will, because organizations do not reward the people who try hardest. They reward the people who create consequences when removed. Let that sink in. Consequences. That word changes the entire frame. If your presence produces no consequences when removed, you are labor. If your absence creates friction, delay, confusion, you are leverage. And leverage quietly terrifies institutions. But this is where another critical mistake appears. The moment most people begin sensing leverage, they rush forward and ask for what they want. This is where the inexperienced strategist ruins the entire position. Because the moment you reveal desperation, the leverage collapses. Power is not maintained through requests. Power is maintained through perception. And the most powerful perception you can create is that your future options may not depend entirely on the organization anymore. This idea introduces something far more dangerous into the minds of those above you. Possibility. The possibility that you might leave. The possibility that someone else might recognize your value. The possibility that replacing you would not be simple. Once that possibility enters the psychological landscape, your position begins transforming. But triggering that shift requires a level of restraint most employees never develop, because it requires resisting the urge to beg and choosing instead to make the organization quietly wonder if it should start convincing you to stay. Here is where the psychology of power becomes almost uncomfortable to observe, because once the possibility of your departure enters the minds of those above you, the entire dynamic begins to tilt. not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. The manager who once assumed your loyalty without question begins watching your behavior more carefully. Your absence from certain conversations becomes noticeable. Your opinions carry slightly more weight when you finally speak. Nothing is said directly, but the subconscious calculation has started. And this is where the Machiavellian strategist does something most employees would find counterintuitive. They do not start demanding, they start expanding. Expansion of influence is the real mechanism behind compensation power. Because organizations rarely pay more for effort, they pay more for territory. Territory can take many forms: control over information, authority over decisions, ownership of relationships, access to knowledge others cannot easily replicate. When you expand your territory, you reshape how the system depends on you. But notice something important. Territory is rarely given, it is absorbed. Most employees wait to be granted authority through titles. They wait for permission to become influential. They assume hierarchy must formally approve their importance. The strategist understands something colder. Influence is usually taken before it is acknowledged. You begin positioning yourself closer to the moments where decisions actually happen. You ask the questions others forgot to ask. You connect information between departments that rarely communicate. And gradually, without announcing it, you become a node in the system, a node that information passes through. This matters more than people realize, because once information begins flowing through you, two psychological shifts occur simultaneously. First, people begin relying on your awareness of situations they cannot fully see. Second, they become uneasy imagining the system without that awareness. This is the moment your value stops being theoretical. It becomes operational. You are no longer just someone who performs tasks. You are someone who helps the machine function. Machines protect the components they rely on, not out of kindness, out of necessity. And necessity is where negotiation becomes effortless. But let me challenge you with something directly. Look at your current position honestly. Are you part of the machine or part of the wiring that keeps it connected? Most employees remain inside the machine itself, replaceable pieces performing defined motions. The strategist moves toward the wiring, the invisible connections, because connections create dependency, and dependency reshapes power. This is why the Machiavellian employee never frames a raise as a reward for past effort. That frame weakens you instantly. Instead, the conversation emerges naturally from your expanding role. Your responsibilities appear larger, your awareness broader, your presence more structurally important. At that point, compensation discussions no longer feel like requests, they feel like adjustments to reality. And humans are far more comfortable adjusting reality than granting favors. Now something interesting happens psychologically. When a manager begins realizing your role has grown, they face two possible paths. They can acknowledge the expansion and stabilize the relationship by increasing your compensation, or they can risk ignoring it and watch uncertainty grow. Uncertainty that you may begin exploring options elsewhere. Uncertainty that someone else might recognize your expanding territory. This tension places quiet pressure on the organization, pressure they would prefer to resolve calmly. And resolution often arrives in the form of an offer before you ever have to ask. Notice the inversion here. Most employees beg. The strategist waits until the system starts negotiating with them. This inversion feels almost unfair to people who have spent years grinding quietly, hoping their effort would eventually be noticed. But power has never followed the rules of fairness. It follows the rules of perception, leverage, and risk. Now let me ask you something directly. If tomorrow you vanished from your workplace, would your absence create silence or would it create questions? because the difference between those two reactions determines whether you will spend your career requesting value or watching others compete to keep you. And in the final layer of this strategy, something even more powerful begins to emerge. Not just leverage, reputation. The kind of reputation that changes how people approach you before negotiations even begin. But reputation, once created, must be protected carefully, because power that is displayed carelessly attracts enemies. Power has a strange side effect. The moment people sense it around you, the environment changes. Not everyone becomes supportive. Not everyone celebrates your growing influence. In fact, the opposite often happens. Because when someone begins rising quietly inside a hierarchy, others begin measuring themselves against that rise. Some will respect it, others will resent it. This is the final psychological battlefield most employees never anticipate. Reputation. Not the shallow reputation of being liked. That is a fragile currency. Popularity fluctuates with mood, gossip, and temporary alliances. Real reputation is something colder. It is the silent understanding that removing you would be inconvenient, perhaps even dangerous to the system. When that reputation forms, people begin treating you differently. Managers listen more carefully. Colleagues hesitate before dismissing your ideas. Your presence carries a weight that cannot easily be explained through job titles alone. But here is where inexperienced strategists make their final mistake. They reveal their power too openly. They start reminding people how important they are. They subtly brag about their influence. They let confidence turn into visible arrogance. And the moment that happens, the social immune system activates. Because human groups tolerate power more easily when it appears restrained. Machiavelli understood this deeply. Power displayed aggressively invites coalitions against you. Power exercised quietly becomes accepted. The strategist protects their reputation by maintaining calm control. They rarely argue loudly. They do not need to dominate every conversation. They allow others to feel comfortable while quietly shaping outcomes behind the scenes. This creates a strange paradox. You become more influential by appearing less desperate to prove influence. And this final layer is what separates temporary leverage from lasting authority. Because once your reputation stabilizes, something extraordinary begins happening in your professional life. Opportunities begin approaching you. Offers appear before requests. Compensation discussions happen earlier, more carefully, sometimes even nervously. Why? Because the system has already concluded something about you. Losing you would create consequences, and institutions fear consequences far more than they value loyalty. Remember where this conversation began. Most employees beg for raises. They prepare speeches. They justify their effort. They hope their manager will recognize their dedication and reward it. But dedication alone rarely commands power. Perception does. Leverage does. Scarcity does. The Machiavellian path does not begin with asking. It begins with quietly restructuring how the system experiences your presence. First, you become competent. Then you become strategically scarce. Then you position yourself where information flows. Then you expand territory without announcing it. And finally, you allow the organization to realize on its own that stabilizing your position may be the safest decision it can make. At that point, the raise is no longer charity, it is containment. Now I want to challenge you directly. After hearing all of this, look at your current position with ruthless honesty. Have you trained your workplace to see you as dependable labor? Or have you begun shaping the perception that your presence carries consequences? There is no neutral ground here. You are either reinforcing your replaceability or quietly engineering leverage. Which side are you on? And if this way of thinking resonates with you, I want to see who's paying attention. Comment this below. I define my own value. People who write that understand something most workers never will. But don't stop there. I want you to go further. In the comments, write one rule you will change starting tomorrow, one behavior you will stop doing, one pattern you will begin controlling, because awareness without action changes nothing. And the rare individuals who truly understand power are not the ones who merely listen. They are the ones who begin moving differently the moment the truth becomes clear.